All right, great. Hi guys, welcome to the Adjudication Workshop. I just want to preface this workshop by saying that there exists a lot of material out there on adjudication. This workshop is meant more than anything to be sort of an introduction to the process of judging a debate, like what needs to happen in a debate and how you evaluate certain things. If you want to look more like higher level things, I highly recommend two particular workshops. The first is the workshop by DMG, Daniel Mayagan, the Ostros Edge Core. I think that they made a workshop before Ostros. I watched it, it was quite interesting. The second is the Education Edge workshop done by Matt Conley Evans, MCE. Also quite informative. Specifically, that workshop is on how to track debates, like your note taking, and how to do it efficiently, and also how to use that when you are giving the oral adjudication. So found it quite helpful. And again, this is meant to be more of an introductory thing rather than a high-level analysis of judging debates. Having said that, I think we can get started. Okay. So we'll be looking at broadly four things in this workshop. Firstly, debating theory. Second, evaluating logical rigor. Third thing is resolving clash points, which is like probably the bulk of judging anyways. And the fourth part is giving the OA itself, because it's not enough to come to the right call. You usually need to explain why you made that call at the end of the day. And that is like quite important, and especially in close debates. Debate is like fundamentally subjective. So it's more about explaining the reasons why you came to this particular decision, which is, I think, a big part of the sport as well. All right, let's first talk a bit about the theoretical aspects of philosophy. So why do we debate? What is the discourse? Like, what is the debate? What is discourse in the first place? I think when it comes down to it, the reason why debating and discourse is particularly important is because in a society with people with different perspectives, opinions, and worldview, when you come to have to work together, when it comes to distributing limited resources and a variety of other situations, there will always be disagreements. And debating specifically is one of the ways to resolve those disagreements in a way that is fair and equitable for everyone. So when you come into a discussion or when you disagree with someone, there's this, like, I would say, a bit of a tendency for people to kind of default into I am right, you are wrong kind of mentality, whereas it is entirely possible that both of you are right. It's also entirely possible that both of you are wrong. And it's also obviously possible that either one of you is right and the other is wrong. So the important thing to know is that at the point where you have that discussion, you don't know that yet, which is why it's important to engage in a kind of fair and like respectful discussion to try to resolve those differences at the end of the day. So debating specifically is the skill of resolving those discourse or those differences. And it's important to engage with your opposing's perspectives or viewpoints, like why they are having that disagreement in the first place, in order to come to a constructive solution. And while parliamentary debating is very focused on like winning, like the comparative, like I am right and like you are like deserve to lose the debate, the skill that you should be drawing, I hope you are drawing from this, is the capacity to appreciate other people's viewpoints, to objectively assess material, identify and challenge your own internal biases, and eventually reach constructive outcomes like as a community and wherever you go. So I think it's an important thing to note. So that's why we debate. There are a lot of hidden assumptions, implicit biases that we have. Debating is one of the ways that we really force ourselves to critically assess the things that we say and things that other people say to come to that end conclusion. So we have intellectual progression because we can have like fruitful discussions that are engaging as opposed to shouting matches. We have social and moral evolution as we accept what is fair and equitable in society. And while debating is great, unfortunately, it can also be quite addictive. And yeah, speaker scores are inherently arbitrary, however, determine our quality of life to an unreasonable extent. So yeah, trade-offs need to be made. All right, cool. So as a debater, as a speaker, the art of debate is inherently the art of persuasion, because you're trying to influence and persuade a neutral party to buy into your point of view. So the techniques that you use, like the comparative, the argument building, the emotional rhetoric, are all very important skills as a speaker. But when it comes to judging or when it comes to adjudication, it is sort of the other side of the coin. So while debating is about persuading, adjudication is about being persuaded. And given that you have two or more teams in the room that's trying to persuade you of two drastically different viewpoints, it is important as a judge for you to remain objective in order to come to the most or the fairest decision possible. So the art of debating, or the art of judging rather, is the art of being objective, making an objective and fair decision, giving contrasting viewpoints and information. And it's sort of an underappreciated skill, I think, in the debate circuit, because generally speaking, especially at selection, like the stronger speakers tend to get selected into teams and go and debate, and like the weaker speakers tend to become judges. I think that judging itself as a skill is quite important. And like career judges, there are some people that for one reason or another don't really get to speak that much, and they become quite good judges. And I think that's an equally legitimate path to success in this sport. Okay, give me a second. All right, yeah. So basically, judging is itself a skill. And if you want to become a better speaker, learn to judge. You want to become a better judge, learn to speak. So yeah, two sides of the same coin. Okay, I said this now. Persuading and being persuaded are opposite sides of the same coin. And as an adjudicator, it's important to be open-minded, be willing to consider fresh perspectives, while at the same time being critical in evaluating the true value of claims. Particularly important when it comes to things that you read on social media. So it's true that you want to expose yourself to different, new information. Essentially, you want to be open-minded, but at the same time, you don't want to accept wholesale all the trash that exists out there. So that's why it's sort of a balancing act between knowing what to accept and what not to accept. And again, it's a skill. So you don't be like Malaysian politicians here, which don't really have much ability in critical thinking or how to talk a lot. Yeah. Okay, so future leaders of the country, please learn how to think critically. All right, so let's first start from who the judge is supposed to be. And the definition of who the judge is has evolved with every year of debating. But ultimately, you're supposed to be someone who is fair and objective, and you're supposed to be like the average reasonable voter. So according to the World's Judging Manual, the average reasonable voter, sometimes called the average intelligent person, or the globally informed citizen, or the average rational person, is basically someone that has these few characteristics. You're aware about basic facts about the world, you know how things were, you haven't been living under a rock, you are familiar with issues that have made international headlines, you should not use specialized knowledge because you are the average person, you're not like someone who is very smart in certain fields, for example. You are also someone that critically assesses things that is said, so you avoid appeals made to emotional authority specifically, because there's not a lot of analysis backing it up. You also avoid presuming any kind of biases or background when assessing arguments. You avoid preferencing arguments and style that makes personal preferences, assess the merits policy of solution, separate from any personal perspective. So basically what all of these things come together to say that as a judge, you shouldn't be biased. That's it. You shouldn't take your personal experiences into account, and you shouldn't take your personal specialized knowledge or background when evaluating arguments. So debate is very much a competitive sport. Persuasion and speech is very, very much subjective. So unlike, sports that have very clear points, if you hit it, you get a point, you don't hit it, you don't get a point. Debating is fundamentally subjective. And that's why as a judge, you want to strive to be as fair and objective as possible. I'm sure we've received results and justification makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So try to imagine yourself in the shoes of the debaters. There are two or more teams in the room. One of them is going to win. One of them is going to lose. Who wins and who loses needs to be determined in the best and fairest way possible. Note, however, that while this is the case, it is the job of debaters to convince the judge to give them the win. It is not the job of the adjudicator to persuade teams of the decision. Okay, so especially for people who are new to judging, there is this quite reasonable fear of making the wrong call per se, and then not being able to justify it. And I think the reality is that the first few times you judge, whether as a panel, as a trainee, it's entirely possible that you don't come to the correct call. My first experiences with judging made a lot of people unhappy, but such is the process of learning. But the important thing to know is that you do not justify calls in order to make speakers happy. You justify it because that is the objectively right thing to do. All right. So long you can justify the decision, it doesn't matter if teams are salty about the call. It doesn't matter that they are unhappy, because your job is to judge the debate. It's not to make the teams happy. And eventually, when it comes down to it, if you build a reputation for being a fair and objective judge, you will usually get the respect that comes to it. Then when you give a team the loss, even if they are extremely salty about it, they will respect your decision because they know you to be someone that's objective and not someone that bends to rep or other things. Cool. So that's basically the philosophical side of debating. Let's now look at the actual evaluation of arguments. So just want to get this out of the way. As a judge, you are expected to be experts in the rules of debating, all right? And while a debate is supposed to be a structured discourse that surrounds central clash points, sometimes team will have very strange ideas about what the debate is supposed to be about, okay? And when that happens, as a judge, it is not just in your interest, it's kind of your responsibility to judge the debate fairly. And if the teams are trying to screw the debate, then you need to judge it accordingly. So screwing the debate means debating the motion, not within the spirit of the motion. So you try to misinterpret the motion, you try to interpret it in some strange way that doesn't make any sense. Unfair time, place, set means you try to debate within a very specific, specialized context that's not accessible to everyone, that you expect teams to debate within that context. It's not fair for them to do that. Definition challenges. Oh, I hate this. Sometimes teams are like, oh, I don't like the way you define the motion, I'm going to challenge it and stuff. As a judge, as long as the definition that the government team provides in the round, or OG and BP, as long as the definition is reasonable, it's not within the prerogative of opposition teams to challenge the definition. So when it comes down to it, sometimes def challenges are warranted, but most of the time when it does happen, it isn't really necessary. And when it does happen, trying to evaluate the debate becomes very difficult. And it usually just comes down to what you find more believable at the end of the day. Burden pushing also. So there are burdens that are imposed by the motion on speakers, like you need to prove this. More often than not, it's proving benefits outweigh the harms, or harms outweigh the benefits, or whatever it is. Sometimes teams will decide to be very creative and say, they don't just need to prove there's harm, they need to prove that they've solved the problem, or they need to prove that it hurts specifically this number of people. And as a judge, you need to be aware of the burdens that motion places on teams. And just because the team says that your opponents have a burden to prove this, does not necessarily mean that is the case. I mean, obviously, sometimes it does mean so, but sometimes teams, especially more senior speakers that want to, kind of scare more junior speakers into taking on a very big burden, will do this thing called burden pushing. And if that is the case, and when that happens, even if the team chooses not to take on that additional burden, or they know that they don't have to do it, they ought to be credited accordingly by you as the judge. Okay, contradictions. Sometimes the team will say A in the first speech, and then they'll say not A in the later speech, which is very annoying because it's very hard to evaluate contradictions. Contradictions, self-defeating claims are one of the few aspects where, as a judge, you can kind of step into the debate because it requires you to choose one or another. Clearly, you cannot credit both claims in the round, right? So when that happens, what you usually should do is you should credit the first claim, but not credit the second, right? So for example, if the OG teams in the PM says that states are bad because they have a tendency of oppressing minorities, and then the second speaker says, no, there's no harm because states usually don't oppress minorities. Clearly, either they oppress or they don't oppress, right? It's two things cannot simultaneously be true. In that case, what you should do is you should credit the claim that was made earlier in the round, and you should discredit the claim that was made later. So if the DPM is trying to say that the harm is not that great because states are not oppressive, you discredit all those responses, which means that the harms that the opposition talks about still weighs against the OG team in this particular exchange. So that's how you evaluate contradiction. Similar for knifing as well. Sometimes, especially if you're opening team in a BP, and your closing team decides to push the rules of logic and try to contradict you. Often, if like CG contradicts OG, like as OG, you don't have any more speeches left in the round. And sometimes the CO team don't want to engage and don't want to take your POI. So you don't have the opportunity to point it out in the debate. But as a judge, if you see that happen, and especially when the knife is like very explicit and very clear, you need to evaluate that accordingly and probably give the closing teams less credit, especially for the impacts that is tied to the contradictory material, because that shouldn't be credited in the round. Yeah. What if the second claim makes more sense than the first one? So you should default to what is most fair and what is most objective in the debate. It's like sometimes contradictions are like unintentional. Sometimes they are quite problematic. Most of the time, contradictions, when they do happen, are a small part of the debate, and you can kind of get away with talking about other more important stuff in the rounds. But sometimes when it is important, when it is like, more significant or very, like, I don't know, very important in the debate, then you have to factor that into consideration. One of the times when knifing can be legitimate is when the opening teams is clearly debating an undebatable debate. So it's like OG comes up and says that murder is great, it's a good thing, and we should commit more murders. Clearly as closing teams, you don't want to defend that. So in that case, it's okay to say, we disagree about opening, we think that murder is bad. It's one of the few cases where you can credit the latter half because it makes more sense. But most of the time, you want to credit the first and not the second. Okay, related to this, new material as well. New material is defined that any material that drastically alters the traction of the argument. So things that cannot be reasonably foreseen. So if it comes out in the op whip, suddenly got a new argument, suddenly got a new stakeholder, a new impact and mechanizing, all that stuff. It comes very late in the round. There is no opportunity for any other speaker to engage it in the debate. It's not something that is fair for the judge to credit in this round, in the debate. So when it comes down to it, new material shouldn't be given credit. You can acknowledge that it was said, acknowledge it could potentially be winning if it came out earlier in the debate and the opponents had a chance to engage it. But because it came out in the whip, it cannot be like credited. Important thing to note as well is that whips, especially up whip, can bring up new responses. So in response to previous arguments, in response to things that were said in the debate, you can bring in new rebuttals. So that is something that as a judge, you should still credit. And generally speaking, rebuttals can be tied back to existing material in the debate, i.e. the thing you are rebutting. So that shouldn't be a problem with regards to crediting it, although sometimes it can feel a little bit unfair. New material is things that cannot reasonably be foreseen from existing material in the debate. And I think kind of related to this also is that reply speeches in AP, absolutely no new responses, new rebuttals. Sometimes teams will put in rebuttals just for the sake of doing it. As a judge, especially if the rebuttal is new, you cannot give credit to it. You kind of have to flag it in the OA as well. Okay, the last one here is strawmans or ad hominem attacks, which is where a team misrepresents the other side and then they rebut the misrepresentation of the argument. It sometimes happens when teams are not very clear in the things that they are saying, or if they use too complex words and the opponents cannot understand what's happening. But when it happens, as a judge, you need to be able to recognize that the rebuttals the team is making is not towards the actual arguments, but rather towards a misrepresentation of the case. And you therefore should probably give less credit to the strawman arguments, sorry, to the strawman rebuttals, or the rebuttals to the strawman rather, because it's not engaging what teams are actually intending to say. Ad hominem means that instead of attacking the argument, you attack the speaker. So like saying, sometimes it will happen, like feminism debates. Oh, you couldn't possibly understand because you are not a woman, which is like, what do you want me to say? Like, sure, lived experiences are important, but just because you don't share those same lived experiences doesn't mean that you cannot have a discussion about those issues. And that's why it's important to accept those arguments at its like intended effect or its like intended meaning, rather than to attack the person that provided the argument, because again, that is not a very fair discussion to be had. Okay, so this is all the stupid things that sometimes happen in the round. Let's talk about more intelligent stuff. So the first thing to note about logical rigor is the standard of proof that you need to have when evaluating a debate. And the standard is balance of probabilities. So standard of proof is just basically how much work you need to do to prove a claim to be true. In criminal court, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is why there's a very, very high burden on the prosecutor to prove that the guilt of this individual. And the reason for this is because criminal sanctions are quite damaging, and that's why you need to meet the high standard of proof. In debates, the standard of proof is the balance of probabilities, which means all you need to do is to demonstrate that your claim is more likely than not to be true. That's enough for you to prove that this claim is true or should be credited as true in the round. Obviously, it doesn't mean that teams cannot respond to it and kind of need to respond to the structural analysis provided by your opponents. But so long there is a claim, there is an analysis or a reason to prove why that claim is true, as a judge, you ought to credit that claim as true. All right, this is also why us as speakers and judges, we are always encouraged to provide structural reasoning why the claims we're making is true. Okay, so examples of this. Expensive products are high in quality. It could be true, but at this point it is an assertion because there's no reason to believe it is true, right? Expensive products are high in quality because the cost of quality material is higher than low quality material. So this suggests a reason why the claim is true, which means by the standard of balance of likelihood, the claim is proven already, right? It may not be a very strong reason. It might not be true in all situations, but it is a reason nonetheless to prove why that claim is likely to be the case. And if in the absence of any responses, as a judge, you ought to credit it as true. Note that the balance of probabilities indicates 51% likelihood, okay? So you don't have to prove it is true in all situations. In fact, I think that's impossible to do most of the time. You just need to prove that this reasoning is true in most instances, 51% of the time. That's enough for you to show balance of likelihood or to meet that particular standard in the debate. Okay, related to this is structural analysis. So structural analysis is basically reason or analysis that applies to the most general case. So it's often tied to the structure or the nature of the subject in question, which is why we call it structural analysis. For instance, businesses are structurally likely to prioritize profits because profits is the reason why they exist, the reason how they maintain their financial stability and continue to add value to the people inside, outside their organization. So across the board, it is true to say that 99% of businesses prioritize profits. Maybe 1% are not very fiscally responsible, shall we say. So not all businesses prioritize profits, especially those that are already well established, but most of them do. And that's why analysis with regard to the profit incentive is quite strong in most debates. Structural analysis is often viewed in opposition to circumstantial analysis, which is analysis or reasoning that only applies to very niche or very specific examples. So for example, saying that people that receive cosmetic surgery are second and third degree burn victims, which is true, it makes sense. But the analysis is not structural, it is circumstantial. Because it is true that burn victims may opt for cosmetic surgery, but it's not true that most people that opt for it are burn victims, right? So you can see that you can analyze burn victims and why it's important they have access to cosmetic surgery, but you are not engaging with the larger and broader debate that most people that opt for cosmetic surgery do so because they just want to look more beautiful. And that is where a majority of the debate needs to exist and needs to happen. Also, just important to note is that when you make framing responses, sometimes there are certain examples or instances where the claim is just true and it makes sense. However, it only happens in the minority of cases. So in that instance, what you do is that you kind of frame these instances out of the debate by explaining why they are likely to be a minority of the situation and why in most other cases it is the whatever other thing you're trying to prove here. And therefore, in the evaluation of this, the evaluation of the clash, sure, it could be beneficial in these small circumstances, but in all other situations, it is harmful, which means that the harm by far outweighs the benefits. Yeah, especially when you're evaluating clashes, sometimes people get hung up on specific examples, and this is one of the ways that you can be kind of you have to be objective, kind of like step out of the debate and look at the bigger picture in terms of evaluating who wins the comparatives. Okay, let's look at intuition for a bit. Sometimes teams will say things in a round that, how to say, I don't know why they will come up with things like that, right? Okay. And when that happens, sometimes the opponents are not going to point it out for whatever reason. In that case, do you credit it as a judge? And the standard you should use usually is what you call the gut check, right? Like, does this instinctively make sense? Does this intuitively make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, then you need to look at the reasoning provided in the debate in order to evaluate that claim in the round. So sometimes things are just not untrue. They're just blatantly untrue, right? Like, brown cows produce chocolate milk because white cows produce white milk. Like, logically speaking, it makes sense. But anyone that understands anything about milk or cows or basic biology knows that this doesn't make sense. So as a judge, you probably shouldn't credit this. Yeah. Some things are counterintuitive. So the claim that expanding choices that individuals have may actually decrease individual utility. Like, the conventional wisdom is that the more choices you have, the more utility you have, right? Because you can choose the choice that is best for you. But counterintuitively, in some cases, expanding the number of choices people have could actually decrease the individual utility. Yeah. Question, how do you justify counterintuitive claims as counterintuitive? And the answer to that is to provide analysis and reasoning as to why that is true, right? So if your claim is that expanding choices decreases individual utility, then you have to explain why that's the case. So things such as having too many options means that sometimes you have information overload. You don't know what choice is best for you in a particular situation. It could also be the case that you make a wrong choice because you didn't process information properly, because you missed out something. So you actively made a choice that was worse for you. Whereas if like the state restricted your choices, then you wouldn't have made that wrong choice in the first place. And thus that actually increases your utility, something like that. People don't get a counterintuitive stuff. So basically, things that are counterintuitive require you to explain them to a greater extent so that the average reasonable person will understand it. So it's like, this is the best example that I can think of right now, but there are a lot of other examples where the claim you are making in the debate can sometimes go against like conventional intuition. And when that happens, it's not enough for you to say it's true, right? Whereas if the claim is intuitive, it can sometimes be enough for you to just say, it is just true that when it rains, you get wet. It is just true that businesses prioritize profit. It is just true that if you slap someone, they will get upset, right? But like, sometimes when the claim is not intuitive, that imposes a greater burden on you as a speaker to explain why that counterintuitive thing is more likely to be the case. Should it be credited if there's reasoning? Absolutely. The point is just that when it comes to asserting things, sometimes assertions are believable, sometimes they are not. And when they are not believable, it is like, on you as a judge, you probably shouldn't believe it, even if you can see reasons why that could be the case. The last thing is spec knowledge. Let's talk about spec knowledge first. There are some things that require specific knowledge in the debate. So for example, the claim like fiscal policy is more effective at curbing a recession than monetary policy. It could be true. If you know anything about economics, you can probably see reasons as to why monetary policy, which is basically printing money most of the time, can actually make a recession worse, especially if it doesn't incentivize inflation or consumption in the ways that you expect it to. In which case, state subsidies can be a better way of going about, improving a recession. But the point here is that if you don't understand much about economics, and most debaters don't understand anything about econs, this statement is not going to make a lot of sense to you. And that's why if teams say it, but they don't explain why that is the case, even if you understand it as a judge, and like sometimes, like I like to think I know econs. Sometimes when I listen to people talk about econs, I don't understand what they're saying. I'm just not going to give credit to the impact that they eventually claim in the round. Like, if they say, fiscal policy is more effective, therefore, we should prioritize spending money on like tax reductions or state subsidies. and that's like it comes a priori in the round. I'm just not going to give credit to that weighing or that impacting because the initial claim was not explained in the first place, and the logical rigor required for the average reasonable person to understand that claim has not been met yet. Okay, someone said, if I say Trump isn't racist, it's counterintuitive. Therefore, I need to give more analysis as to why that's true. And yes, that's absolutely correct. However, I think in this particular case, you will find it a bit difficult to find analysis as to why that is true. In which case, probably the claim should be rejected at face value. Okay, anyone else still have questions about this? Okay, let's move on. Still don't get spec knowledge. So basically, not everyone in debates have spec knowledge, right? And if you reference things using technical jargon without explaining what that jargon is, or without explaining how that policy works, then as the average reasonable person, I don't understand it, and therefore I cannot credit it in the round. So for example, like you see here, right, fiscal policy more effective than monetary policy. Like, do you understand it? Do you understand why that's true? Do you understand how that works? And if you don't, like even if I as the judge understand it, other teams in the room may not understand it. The average reasonable person wouldn't understand it, which is why it's not fair for me as a judge to credit it and then say, you didn't respond to prove why monetary policy is better because it hasn't been explained in the first place. So that's like the intuition, the bar to intuition that must be met in order for you to give credit to an argument. I think if we work through more examples, it can become clearer later on. Okay, so as what I said earlier, the standard to be used in terms of whether to buy a claim at face value is what the average global, reasonable, informed, rational voter would know. Okay, average reasonable person. They have basic knowledge of science and math, which is why they can reject the Cow analysis. They have basic awareness of world events. They know that COVID is a thing. They know that poverty exists. They know that they probably know that vaccines don't cause autism, although bit hard to believe nowadays. And they don't have specialized knowledge, be it geographic, be it academic, etc. This is also important because, especially if you join international tournaments, there's this very there's this tendency to use examples from your home country. Right? Filipino debaters say, in the Philippines, we have this, that, and the other. And Malaysian debaters, in Malaysia, we have this, that, and the other. And the Japanese debaters, in Japan, we got this, that, and the other. Which is great. It could prove the argument, but the examples need to be explained. Like let's say you are like a Malaysian team meeting and like, I don't know, Australian team on a debate with a Malaysian judge. And then you reference all the Malaysian examples that Australian teams don't get, they don't understand. Like, is it fair for the judge to credit those examples without any explanation against a team that doesn't understand the examples and cannot engage with it like reasonably? I don't think so. So that's why you should not utilize your spec knowledge, your geographical background when evaluating claims from debaters. Everything needs to be explained. Nothing can be assumed in the debate. So if it doesn't meet the standard or the bar the intuition bar, then the things that are said should not be credited unless there's further explanation, even if you know those things to be true. All right. So that's why everything in the debate needs to be explained. Everything, all the implications, all the reasoning, all of it needs to be made explicit in the round. If not, assumptions are held, could potentially cost you the debate. As a judge as well, you need to be aware of those like hidden assumptions that exist. Catch teams that are doing it, catch yourself if you're doing it, and factor that into the adjudication at the end of the round. Okay, the next part here is mechanization. So mechanization, simply put, is just process analysis required to prove that an outcome is going to happen. So most of the time in debates, the outcomes suggested can be quite intuitive. Things like, media transparency creates greater political accountability, like very intuitive, like probably true in some cases as well. But mechanistic analysis is particularly important to prove two things with regards to outcomes analysis. The first is the likelihood of success, and the second is the scale of impact. So just saying that media transparency increases accountability does not actually prove that that's likely to happen in most cases. Again, remember the standard is balance of likelihood. While the claim is intuitive, it has yet to be proven because this is just an assertion. So the mechanistic analysis of the reasons why this claim is true, the processes through which transparency actually creates that better accountability to prove that it's likely to happen in a majority of cases. The second thing here is like the scale of outcomes. Like, we have transparency, we have more accountability. Like, sure, you can prove like a comparatively more accountability in your side, but how much accountability do you actually get? And how do people actually benefit? And here's where scale analysis is particularly important, tipping point analysis as well. So yeah, sure, it's not just the fact that we get a bit more accountability. The tipping point here is the people who are willing to run for election and such that we can actually have like a functional opposition, which is like that, what you don't get in the alternative. So the scale analysis and the tipping point analysis all comes down to mechanization. And that's why evaluating mechanisms as a judge is like important in the debate as well. Note that unmechanized outcomes are speculative and uncertain. It's not that it's not going to work. And sometimes teams will just say, they don't explain it to be true and they expect that to be sufficient to take down the argument. Like, that's not enough. Teams need to disprove the likelihood of outcomes materializing by providing their own and challenging the mechanistic analysis or like the lack of it rather in this debate. So for example, in the initial claim that transparency increases accountability, the first step obviously to say that at no point did the government prove why this is true. But the second step is to suggest reasons why, even if you increase transparency, you're not actually going to get improved accountability, like talking about elections, talking about gerrymandering, talking about informational asymmetry, talking about ability for rich people to spin media narratives in their favor, etc., etc., etc. All reasons as to why the likelihood of success is quite low. Note also, later we're going to look at sometimes there's a trade-off of outcomes. Mechanized outcomes beat unmechanized outcomes any day of the week. So if you explain the process to why this outcome is true, even if the impact is not like that great, it's proven to a greater extent than as sort of an assertive outcome in the alternative. And that's why that's still something we should credit to a greater extent than outcomes that are not proven in the round. Okay, the last thing under logical rigor is evidence. So what proof do you have that your argument is true? Again, analysis is important, but it cannot exist in the abstract. Evidence, context, examples, etc. are required to visualize impacts in the round. So for example, saying giving money to poor people improves their lives, like it could be true. You can provide analysis as to why that is the case, but the evidence required or evidence needs to be provided in order to demonstrate that in a real world context, this claim actually makes sense and has been proven to happen before. So evidence is, especially in like specialized knowledge debate, like international relations, maybe you don't have examples all the time or like real world examples you can point to. Evidence can also come in the form of characterization. It can also come in the form of the visualization or the illustration of how things look like, because that's kind of required for you to kind of see how those benefits materialize in the debate. So even if you don't provide actual examples, the illustration as to how things look like and how things happen also counts towards the evidence portion of an argument. And when it comes down to evaluating evidence, obviously the team that provides or does more work into characterizing outcomes, more work into describing how things look like, is going to have an edge because it's easier to visualize how those things look like. But also if the other team does not contest the characterization, then that becomes the only like framework or perspective in the debate, and can also be a reason as to why you find this outcome more persuasive than the alternative, because in this context, it appears to benefit more people most of the time. So important thing to do when assessing evidence. And also important when assessing the lack of evidence provided by teams. Like, sure, you could have an outcome, you could have a benefit, but it's unclear the extent to which that benefit materializes in the round. And that's why in terms of weighing it against the alternative, you may not necessarily weigh it as significantly, especially if the other team provided counter evidence as to why that's the case. Yeah, so in terms of giving money to poor people, whether you use it for useful things, whether you use it for not so useful things, case studies on where UBIs have been implemented and a success is the evidence required to prove that the analysis is true. But also, when it comes to breaking deadlocks, evidence is also one of the deadlock breakers. So usually debates about UBIs, The side that says we should give money is going to say they're going to use it for brilliant things. The side that's opposing it will say, no, they'll use it for all sorts of horrible things like drugs and alcohol. The deadlock breaker here as to what is more likely to be true comes down to the evidence that teams provide, why their claim is more likely than the alternative. So that's an important part of assessing likelihood as well. Okay, not importantly, evidence alone does not make the argument, right? You need to provide the analysis, like saying things like, you see recidivism is a thing. Therefore, rehab in the CJS is completely useless because you see this one person committed crime again, which like what it does prove that maybe the rehabilitative process is not perfect, but by no means does it prove that rehabilitation is absolutely and completely useless. If you want to make that claim in the debate, you need to back it up with reasoning and analysis as to why that is true. So evidence needs to be backed up with analysis. Analysis needs to be backed up with evidence. One cannot exist without the other, although they sometimes do, and that make the judge's life very difficult. Okay, anyone have any questions before we move on? What if people bring up stuff like statistics in the debate as evidence? So I would just note that empirical data, so like statistics, it's not very persuasive as evidence. Like, how do you verify the stats? Like, if I want to say that it's a policy is helpful, I say, 70% of the people in society support it. Like, it's not particularly persuasive when it comes down to it. And again, the bar to assess things is like the intuition, the intuition bar. Would the average reasonable person know these stats? Like, and if they wouldn't, then probably that statistics require a bit more explanation, and not just in terms of numerical data, but in terms of the reasons why 70% of people might support this particular policy. And the reasoning behind it is usually the more persuasive aspect of the argument. So, like, if you are judging a debate where teams bring in stats without further backing it up, then I think I would just give it a lot less credit. So I'll just point out that maybe government suggests that the benefits accrue because of this percentage of people, which could be plausible, but it's not clear as to why that's the case, because they don't really explain it or prove it in any other way, or provide any other kind of analysis or reasoning to back it up. And that's a reason, that's like a fair reason to kind of, discredit evidence that might not even be true in the first place. Okay, any other questions? If not, we'll move on. The next part here is clash resolution. So, like, in a lot of debates, before you even reach the clash, there's all kinds of strange things that needs to be dealt with before that. And that comes back to like the logical, assessing the analytical rigor of the arguments being made. Because if things are not true, if things are not proven, if things are assertive, if things are wildly unbelievable, then like the clash is not happening. So those things need to be assessed first before coming to the clash. So honestly speaking, in lower rooms and lower level debates, you may not even have clash points in the first place because teams are not even clashing with each other. Sometimes debates become quite parallel, especially definitional debates. So clashes don't really happen. But as you improve as speakers and you advance from the lower to the middle to the higher rooms, clash resolution becomes increasingly important because it's not enough to prove that a benefit exists. That benefit needs to be weighed against the harms of the policy. All right, so what is a clash? Clash points are points where teams disagree within an agreed framework of a discussion. All right, the second part here is arguably more important. If you cannot agree on the premise of the debate, then your points of disagreement is not, the discussion cannot like function in the first place. So for example, in actor debates, right? Teams usually agree on who the actor is and what they want, like the incentives of the actor, moral obligations or principal obligations if they have any. But the clash is usually they disagree on where the actor is better off, right? So the clash here is that the framework of the debate is who best protects the actor, and the clash is on which side the actor better protected. So the agreed framework of the debate, or identifying that, is particularly important when you are judging the debate, because if you don't have the framework to evaluate the material that is said in the round, it firstly becomes a lot harder to track the material that is said, especially when you have teams that are rapping at bullet train speed. And when things are said, if you don't see its implication on the clash, it can sometimes like slip out of your mind. Again, there's a lot of stuff happening in debates, and judging 4 rounds a day can be quite tiring. So that's why establishing that framework of what the debate is about in the first place, and bearing that in mind when you are following the clash and when you are following rebuttals especially, is very, very important in terms of tracking the comparative in the round and who is ahead on what at various points in time. Okay, I hope that's clear. How do you identify clash points? So you first need to identify what teams agreed on. Okay, the premise of the discussion must either be explicitly agreed on by teams, like either implicitly or explicitly. So explicitly is like, for example, in actor debates where the PM, the LO go up there, the actor wants this, that, and the other, and then broadly we agree with the actor's incentive. So we agree that the actor wants this. That is like what the framework is. And then you can actually have a discussion about which side is best able to cater to the actor's interests. Or like policy debates, or like banning stuff. Both sides will probably agree on like, social contract and the extent to which states can intervene in individuals' autonomy. Then the clash becomes about whether or not the harms outweigh autonomy in this case, or like whether it doesn't. So as a judge, you need to identify that framework first to be able to track the material and how that clash evolves in the round. Sometimes the clashes are not explicit, they're implicit. So social movements debates, for example, both sides say we want to protect the most vulnerable stakeholder, we want to protect the minorities in the round. That becomes sort of the implicitly agreeing on what the premise of the debate is. That is to say, in which side are minorities better protected, and like that makes it easier for you to track the clash. After you identify what teams agree on, then you can identify where teams disagree. And especially if you're taking notes, you kind of want to frame the clash explicitly. So usually what I would do is that when teams are clashing on something, if it's like part of an argument or it's part of a rebuttal, I would just sort of track it in a separate part. Like I would kind of open a new paragraph or something, or I'll put it in like a separate section of my notes, because it becomes a lot easier to go back on your notes at the end of the round to see what teams have said on a specific clash. I'll just note also is that debates seldom only have one clash. There are usually at least 2 clashes in the round. So when that happens, tracking what was said and different clashes can become a bit confusing, which is why I think framing the clash explicitly is a very key part of simplifying material and making it easier to filter information as it comes like a speeding bullet in debate. Especially important if teams don't make the clash explicit. You kind of know what the initial clash is from the burdens of the round, but how exactly it manifests in the debate would depend on responses and engagement. You kind of want to make that explicit to make like your life easier, and also easier to give DOA later on. Parallel debates, definitional debates, is where teams do not agree on what the debate is about in the first place. So if Gulf teams say we define the motion like this, and Ops say, no, we define the motion some other way, there's no engagement, parallel discussion, be absolute painful to judge, right? And those kinds of debates usually just come down to what the judge finds to be mildly more believable in the round, especially if the opposition team is like challenging a perfectly debatable definition. So unfortunately, it does happen sometimes, and not going to be very instructive for anyone when it does. Okay, explicit clash points is where teams are nice for you. Usually happens in higher rooms where teams are aware of what clashes are, what needs to be done to win them, and why they're important in winning the debates. So they are going to explicitly frame the clash in the round. This debate is about where social movements are better off, where do we maximize the value of limited resources, who best protects the most vulnerable actors in the round, they will frame the clash for you. And then like after they frame the clash, like, I mean, if they're able to identify the clash, they'll probably be able to identify reasons why they win the clash as well. And obviously they'll also deal with things that is said by the other side in terms of like the comparative. So when clash points are made explicit, tracking them as a judge is a lot easier. So if you judge debates where teams do this for you, then your life is very easy. If you judge debates where teams don't do this for you, then it gets significantly harder. But also, as a debater or as a speaker, it's probably in your interest to make those clash points explicit so that the judge can find it easier to follow the things that you are saying, especially if the judge is like a bit new. Okay, implicit clash points is where there's some discussion because teams will make you do the work to track it. What you need to do first is to identify what the clash point is in the first place. And how to do that is like what we discussed earlier. Like, you first need to start with the premise of the debate, what teams agree on, to then branch out into what teams disagree on to identify what the clash is in the round. After that, then you track what teams said to win that particular clash. So for example, if the debate is like that social movements should use violence or that it's justified for them to use violent protests, then teams might say on one hand that violence is bad because it gives you a negative perception, generates all kinds of backlash that will hurt your ability as a movement. And on the other side, the side that justifies violence will say, there's no other way to possibly achieve change in the round. That's why we absolutely have to do it. So when it comes down to it, the central point of the disagreement is whether or not we ought to use violence, right? But the overarching end conclusion that teams are moving for is the best way for social movements to manifest better outcomes for minorities. So the clash essentially is on which side or where are movements more effective at gathering change, right? And this is sometimes where teams don't do this framing for you, is where you need to do the framing for teams, where you kind of step out of the debate and have a look at what teams are actually trying to achieve in the round to be able to identify where the clash is going and what teams are trying to prove. It's also particularly important when it comes down to weighing clashes at the end of the debate. We're going to look at the types of clashes, I think, right now. Yeah, okay. So broadly speaking, there are two types of clashes. There are journey clashes, there are destination clashes. Incidentally, there are also journey debates and destination debates, so related to it. Destination clashes are where teams argue for mutually exclusive end goals, right? All rights debates or rights clashes are destination clashes. Limits on autonomy, one side says restrict autonomy, the other side says respect autonomy. So clearly you cannot have autonomy and not have it at the same time. You have to trade it off. These are destination clashes. Journey clashes are where teams agree on the same end goal, but argue for how to get there. Most social movements debates, or like clashes rather, are journey clashes because both sides are probably going to agree that movements want to achieve specific end goals. The question is just on how do you get to those particular end goals at the end of the day, like who benefits minorities more, who is more effective at garnering change, garnering awareness, or whatever the case may be. So that's why there are two different types of clashes, and the way you evaluate those clashes have to change as well. Just note also that debates are quite complex, and it's perfectly possible for a clash to have both a journey clash and a destination clash. But when you are evaluating it and when you are prioritizing what is more important, sometimes people can get mixed up, and it's important that you don't do that. Okay, what does framing a clash point look like in the speech? Framing the clash point just basically is you saying the word. The clash in this debate is who is more effective at garnering change. We give you 3 reasons why movements are more effective, 1, 2, 3, to which the op only chooses to respond to the first, which means that at the end of this clash, we are still ahead because we provided more reasons why we are more effective at garnering change. Like the implication of this then is that our side is more effective at protecting the most vulnerable person in the debate. So framing the clash point is very closely tied to meta debating. It's telling me what the discussion is about before you jump straight into that discussion. Also note that, again, implicit clashes, not good for anyone in the debate. the judge doesn't know where you're coming from, what you're trying to prove. So framing things at the start of that clash and telling me what you are going to say and why you are saying it is like very, very helpful in terms of clarifying things and making it easier for the judge to understand you and follow what you are saying. So if speakers do that for you as a judge, then your life is a lot easier. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so when it comes to destination clashes, there are two types, outcomes and principles, basically. Outcome clashes is where you need to trade one outcome off for another, right? So for example, I was judging this debate at Sunway. It was about the decline of class-based politics and stuff, which is basically where one side argues for politics based on economic policy and the other side argues for policies based on identity politics. And it's clearly these two things cannot simultaneously exist. You need to prioritize one over the other, right? So this is where it's a clash of outcomes where the overarching claim is who is more effective at protecting people, but the individualized clash is the process through which you get there in the first place. So the first point of resolving a outcome clash is in terms of evaluating the likelihood of success. And again, mechanized outcomes beat unmechanized outcomes any day of the week. So if one side explains process through which the outcomes materialize, and the other side asserts the outcome is going to happen, then the evaluation is very clear. Like, I'm trading off a clear and certain outcome for nothing, like very, very fluffy stuff. So that's why as a judge, assessing the mechanization and the strength of the mechs is particularly important in assessing the strength of the outcome, because when you are trading one outcome off for another, what is more important, what has a greater scale of the benefits, what has the larger impact on the debate is key in determining what you ought to prioritize or what you should value as greater in the round. So that's the first step, whether or not the outcome has been proven. The second step then is to evaluate engagement, right? So past a certain point, teams are actually going to have mechanisms in their speeches. You then need to assess the strength of the mechanisms and the ability for other teams to contest the mechanization in the round. So if let's say like we go to the debate about media transparency and political accountability, let's say the Gov teams provide reasons as to why transparency does create that accountability, right? Because politicians care about their image. They're going to stand for election again, and the voters know that politicians have been abusing their power. They're less likely to vote for them, going to vote for their political opponents instead. So that provides the direct incentive to be more accountable and to not like screw up in the first place. So the other side is going to then contest the mechanization. Is it true that media transparency creates accountability in the way that Gov identifies it? And then you can suggest that it might not necessarily be true that people are going to watch the news, given that they are quite busy. It might not necessarily be true they're going to watch this specific news, given the airtime is limited. They might be watching other things. It's not necessarily true that assuming they do watch the news, they're going to vote in the first place, because voter disengagement is a problem. And assuming all of that is true, it's not necessarily the case that the political opponents are, palatable in the first place. And that's why the corrupt politician currently in power might still be the lesser of two evils compared to someone who is completely incompetent. Yeah, just look at Malaysian politics. So in that case, the engagement or engaging the mechanization suggests that the opposition is able to question the likelihood to which accountability manifests in the round. And obviously, of course, on Gov, you can defend it, and you should defend it using examples and counter analysis. But at this point, the op is able to suggest reasons why the outcome would not happen. And if the opposition have a counter outcome on the other side, like I don't know, we haven't done media debates in a while. But if they have a counter outcome and they're able to disprove the outcome from their opponents, then the way off again is straightforward. You have a proven outcome or a stronger outcome against a unproven outcome, or at least a deconstructed outcome. And that's like why the outcome here is still stronger at the end of the debate. The final thing to evaluate then after engagement is weighing. So we're going to look at that later. But the point here is that assuming it's true that both sides is able to prove an outcome, like one side proves X outcome, the other side proves Y outcome. The reasons why we should prioritize Y over X is based on the weighing on certain metrics. So certainty, for example, which stakeholder you protect, the scale of the impact in the round, what's like more important, like what creates greater benefits, very different weighing metrics. But team, again, it is the burden on teams to weigh those outcomes for you. And as a judge, what you, especially if teams don't do it, then you need to find those metrics and the reasons why you valued this outcome over the other, because it was winning on this particular metric that was particularly relevant for the debate in this way. Okay, someone have a question? Let's say one person I edge ends up giving an argument that does link to the clash. As IDC, there was this house would give death penalty to drug-related crimes, and one guy on prop said, drug dealers merosakkan image negara, so I must die, so they must die. I don't understand, there's no clash here. So it's like, presumably one side is saying that you want to give the death penalty for drug-related crimes. The other side is saying that we shouldn't give the death penalty, right? And so the clash here is like whether or not we should give them the death penalty. And then the team that is justifying the death penalty needs to give reasons why they support the death penalty. And the team on the other side obviously needs to give reasons why we shouldn't support the death penalty. So in this case, the reasoning provided by Gov is that they are ruining the image of the country. I guess that's a reason why we should support the death penalty, which I cannot evaluate in a vacuum. Like, I need to hear how the op responded to it, what they said in comparison, especially reasons why we shouldn't support the death penalty, in order to like weigh in the round now. But I think this reasoning alone, probably I would not find very persuasive, because it's just very speculative on the extent to which the image of the country, like something that I should value in the round. Yeah, I don't think you should discredit it on face value. I think you should factor it into consideration, but I would just note that it's not that hard to disprove that line of analysis if you're opposition. Okay, let's talk about principles. So most of the time, principles are mutually exclusive. I say most of the time because sometimes principles can coexist, and sometimes there are like higher principles and lower principles in terms of like priority or like analytically or otherwise. So when principles are mutually exclusive, i.e. one side says obligation to others, and the other side says obligation to yourself, which is the more important principle, the first point of resolution is evaluating the relevance of the principal arguments in the round. So again, when it comes to principles, they cannot exist in the abstract, right? It is perfectly legitimate for you to say that in some cases, we have an obligation to help others. You see someone is like, I know, bleeding out on the street. Probably you have an obligation to try to help them, or to at least call an ambulance. Where at the same time, if you're in a burning building, and you know, there's someone that's trapped in another room, maybe your obligation to yourself comes first, because you need to protect yourself first, right? So it is perfectly possible for you to have an obligation to yourself. It's perfectly possible for you to have an obligation to other people. Principles cannot exist in the abstract. They need to be contextualized to the specific debate. So what is possible to have obligations in like a variety of different ways? The question in the round is, in this particular circumstance, which obligation is greater, right? And that's where the contextualization comes into the debate. So it doesn't matter. Any principle that you want to argue, principle of reciprocity, principle of reparations, principle of representation, principle of democratic like participation, principle of fairness and equitability, principle of like self-defense, for example, cannot exist in a vacuum. It needs to be contextualized in the round. So again, if teams just assert that there is a principle at stake here, without explaining how it is relevant to debate, then in terms of whether or not that principle is important, especially if like you are trading off like tangible harms on the other side, it's not clear why we ought to value this over the other, over like potential outcomes, right? So that's why the first point of evaluating principal arguments is whether or not it is relevant to this specific debate. Teams that are good will give you reasons why we should value the principle, and then obviously the other side can engage it. But the point here is that teams that assert principles in a vacuum should not be given a lot of weight in the round. Assuming that teams do prove why principles are relevant, the next step is to evaluate analytical rigor. So is it true that the principle is proven? Is it true that the principle exists in the first place? So again, it depends on the context, it depends on relevance. Sometimes obligation analysis requires a pretty high burden to prove. Sometimes principles are quite straightforward or like can be assumed to be true. You know, for example, the criminal justice system has an obligation to protect people in society, or like there's a principal duty for them to do this. There's a principal duty for them to rehabilitate criminals. Like these are things that we can assume to be true in debates. But at other points in time, like, you know, religious leaders have a spiritual duty to fulfill like the word of God. Like these are things that need to be proven to be true in the debate, because it's not necessarily the case that has to be. So evaluating the analytical rigor and evaluating whether the principle has been proven to be true is the first step in evaluating principle clash. The next step then is to evaluate how teams engage with it. So just because you say there's a principle of reciprocity in this situation, like in the debate about whether children owe reparation to their parents, the reparative duty needs to be explained by prop, obviously, but the other side can then say that it's not necessarily true that the reparative duty exists because of this, that, and the other. Children didn't consent, therefore there exists no contractual obligation here, which kind of disproves the fact that the principle of reciprocity exists, right? In that case, then if they are able to disprove that principle, then the counter principle will probably stand. But if they're not able to disprove it, i.e. they give reasons that are not like strong or not necessarily substantiated, you could still value the initial claim as true because of insufficient engagement. Again, standard of proof to be met is balance of probabilities. They need to provide reasons why on balance the justification is true, or on balance why the justification is not true. And as a judge, you need to track what is said in the debate to assess it. Okay, the important part about destination clashes is that at the end of all destination clashes, you have to do weighing to demonstrate why you prioritize one outcome over another. So because it is a trade-off of two mutually exclusive outcomes or principles, if teams do enough work to explain why both of them are pretty good options in the debate, it needs to be explained why one option is preferable to the other. And the way to weigh those outcomes is based on explicit metrics in the debate. There are common metrics like utilitarianism, which side creates better outcomes, which side benefits more number of people. Certainty, for example, maybe you can argue that we should prioritize certain outcomes over speculative benefits, even if it was potentially greater in the future. Maybe we ought to err on the side of caution because the risk is not worth it, especially if you have people under your care. You can weigh on vulnerability. We protect the more vulnerable actor in this round. So even if it's true that majority of people lose out, we would rather like 100% loses $1 as opposed to one person lose $100 because the impact on that one person is disproportionate. That's why we ought to protect the most vulnerable one. Various different metrics to use to weigh outcomes. I think weighing is a workshop all on its own. I don't think there's a shortage of weighing workshop out there. But the point here is that when you are evaluating a destination clash, at the end of the clash, there needs to be reasons as to why you value one outcome over the other. Again, sometimes metrics will be implicit. You need to track it. Sometimes it will be made explicit where teams are nice, and then you can then just use the metrics that teams provide for you. Just one thing to note here is that there are a variety of different metrics that exist in debates, right? Like trade-off of outcomes can be weighed one way on this metric or the other on a different metric. And as a judge, it's important for you to be fair and objective and to only default to metrics that teams use in the debate. So for example, like occasionally you will come across teams that are very strong in proving that the outcomes will materialize, but make zero effort at weighing the outcomes, right? So for example, if one team proves, like in the social movement should be support violent protest debates, one team proves very strongly that violent protest creates change. But the other side provides reasons as to why. Even if it's true, violent protest is more effective. We ought to value like justice, or we ought to value the not harming innocence as a principle in the debate. And the other team just does not come back from that at all whatsoever. In that context, because one team provides weighing and the other team does not, you need to default to the team that provided that weighed the outcomes for you, because they weighed the outcomes for you and the other side didn't. So it's not fair for you as a judge to say, but I just felt that this was the more important thing in the debate. It could be true, it could be intuitively the bigger outcome in the round, but you have to be non-interventionist in the way that you evaluate claims based on metrics that teams did provide you in the round. Yeah. Okay, journey clashes. These are clashes where the end goal is either exactly the same or is quite similar. It usually happens where both teams want to okay, there's something wrong with my slides here. But it usually happens where both teams want to achieve the same outcome, but they disagree on the way of going about achieving that particular outcome. Just give me a second, yeah. Okay, anyways, let's just talk about this for a bit. So journey clashes are where both teams want to achieve the same outcome. You disagree on how you want to get there. So social movements, debates, both sides want to protect minorities. The question is, which side does it better? So there are debates about public shaming, like call-out culture. Should we support call-out culture, or should social movements publicly call out politicians, for example? Those clashes usually come back to how best are movements going to be able to achieve their end goals. Most of the time, their end goals are going to be to protect the minorities within that movement that their purpose was to protect in the first place. So in that particular context, the pathway towards change is quite important in terms of evaluating it, or in terms of evaluating who wins the clash. Because at the end of the clash, both sides are going to protect minorities, right? The question is, which side does it better? When it comes to raising awareness, for example, when it comes to getting donations, for example, there are various different ways to get it. The question is, on comparison, on scale, which side gets more of that particular outcome? Because more money and more awareness usually translates to more change, most of the time, not always, which means that the side that is able to prove that they get a greater degree of awareness is almost always going to be ahead in that particular exchange. So sometimes the end goal can be quite broad, in which there are different outcomes that could potentially lead towards that end goal, where you have to make a trade-off. Sometimes the end goal is more narrow, such as parent-child debates, where most of the time the clash is about who best protects the child, whether parents should make medical decisions for children, whether doctors should do so. The clash is who is the better actor to make that particular decision. And the end goal is the same, that is to protect the best interest of the child. So when in terms of evaluating journey clashes, the first thing to establish is, again, mechanization, right? Which side is better able to prove that their side of the house creates this specific outcome for people. The second thing then is to do the comparison, because journey clashes are quite hairy in the sense that sometimes the outcomes are not mutually exclusive, which is why the scale comparison is particularly important. And sometimes teams run this response of saying, the outcome is not mutually exclusive, so it is entirely symmetric. And just because it is not exclusive does not mean it is fully symmetric, right? It's possible that one side gets more of that specific outcome, but the onus is on teams to prove why they get comparatively more. And you as a judge need to track the reasons that they give as to why they are winning or ahead on that particular clash with regards to achieving the end goal. So be aware of what teams said and don't stop the tracking at teams saying, not mutually exclusive, because there could still be a comparative that the other side is ahead on. Generally speaking, jury clashes are more on outcomes, less on principles, because you will usually agree on the principle. And the question is the extent to which those outcomes materialize. Okay, clash point resolution is important. So it's not enough to track the clash. Later on, we're going to see explaining how the clash evolved from speaker to speaker is important, which is why you need to take note of what was said in which speaker, so that you can use that to justify how the clash progressed and what teams said that proved they win their side of the comparative. Okay, I know it's a bit abstract, but it is what it is. Anyone have questions on the section before we move on? Ryan, I'm going to ignore you. Okay, let's move on to the oral adjudication. So the OA is basically the justification for the call. Again, debates about fairness and about objectivity and about the most equitable outcome for all teams. Okay, so when you make a decision in a debate, you need to justify that particular decision. And the justification for your decision is called the oral adjudication. There's a couple of things that you kind of need to take note of in the OA. The first thing is that you want to be clear about the thought process behind evaluating clashes. And related to this, you kind of want to spend less time talking about what was said in the round and spend more time talking about the evaluation of that material. So for example, if you are evaluating the clash on social movements using violence as a means to achieve end goals, there'll be a lot of examples, there'll be a lot of mechanisms provided in the round. You don't have to flesh them out entirely. You want to move straight to the evaluation of the debate. Eventually then came down to which side was more effective in achieving change. Government provided 3 lines of analysis to explain efficacy. The opposition was able to engage that by explaining why, is that the other, suggesting that it was probably not necessarily true, that violence was always going to be effective, but then suggesting on the comparative that non-violent ways could also achieve change result then, right, through this, that, and the other mechanism. So at the end of the clash, I was more persuaded that non-violence was more effective, like because they were able to point to more examples where it was successful, whereas the instances where violence was successful in like the Gulf side maybe is because there existed non-violent alternatives or like something like that. So the point here is that you want to be clear about the thought process behind the evaluation of the clashes, because teams care more about why you thought of things a certain way rather than what you actually thought of it. Yeah, so just be clear. Okay, start with the verdict. Don't do this thing where I will hold you all in suspense for the next 15 minutes while I waddle through my notes. Okay, it's horrible. Teams then miss the verdict, or they tend to zone out and they don't like score you properly. So again, what makes an OA good? It's short, simple, and sweet. So straight to the point, start with the verdict, the reasons why you felt a certain team won. Try to summarize as much as possible things that has already been said and reference material that was said in the round. Okay, so sometimes like I felt this outcome was more important feels like you are not a very good judge, but saying things like the op-whip pointed to 2 reasons why I should value these outcomes more shows that you are tracking what is happening in the debate. So you want to reference that when you're giving the OA. When you're justifying the decision, in AP, there are only 2 teams, so you can proceed directly to clash point. You start with the most important clash, explain why it's the most important clash in the round, and then move to any subsidiary clashes. Most of the time in AP debates, you have at least 2 clashes. On one side, you're going to want like the first clash is whether or not the Gulf achieves this particular outcome. And the second clash is whether or not the op achieves like their outcome. And then the weighing of the clashes is why one clash is more important than the other. Can come down to firstly, where teams spent more time on a specific clash, where teams provided more impactful analysis on a specific clash, where teams provided stronger analysis or mechanization on a specific clash, or where teams provided greater comparative analysis on the clash. So on the other hand, if teams don't really flesh out material, like they don't spend that much time talking about it. There's a clash, sure, but that clash is less important than the clash that teams spent most time talking about. And so you should start with the most important clash because it's the primary deciding factor of the debate. And again, don't want to keep teams in suspense for too long. The only really real exception to this is you want to have any miscellaneous comments, you can put it at the start of the OA before you start the verdict. But generally speaking, I think it's more helpful to put it at the end because then it becomes like teams don't have to pay attention for that long. And after a 1 hour debate, yeah, mental faculty is not working that well. In BP judging, there are 6 comparisons to be made between the 4 teams. Note that BP judging is an independent assessment. So that means that if OG is losing to O, the opening exchange, CG comes in with very strong responses. They cannot rebut the O so hard that O also loses to OG. Okay, no such thing. So if the CG's responses is evaluated independent of the opening exchange, so maybe it's strong enough to put CG above the opening up. Maybe the strongest responses also puts them above opening up. But the point is that it does not affect the evaluation between OG and OO. So when you are giving the oral adjudication in a BP debate, you want to keep these 6 comparisons distinct, right? So my personal preference is to first start with the opening exchange and then factor in either closing costs, depending on which is easier to resolve and get out of the way. I prefer to do the easier comparisons first and then move on to the tighter or the closer clashes later on, so I can spend more time on it without worrying about running out of time for the OA. But again, how you want to do the OA is up to you. There's no rule that says that you must, do opening first or that you must do intra-bench comparisons first, as long as you walk through all 6 comparisons at the end of the OA. So what you shouldn't do is to jump back and forth. So when you're assessing why CG beats OG, don't suddenly jump in, but this is also a reason why OG loses to OO because of that one. Just keep it distinct, and if there is some overlap, just point it out twice in the different comparison, it's fine. Easier to keep track of as well. Also, as a BP team, or if you're debating in a BP round, I don't know about you guys, but I don't particularly care about the ranking of the other teams. I care more about how my team factor against the other 3 teams in the round. So keeping teams clear and distinct will also make the team's life easier. And if their life is easier and they're happier, they usually will give you higher scores as well. Yeah. Okay, so I guess that's more or less it for this specific workshop. When it comes down to adjudication, there's only so much you can learn from theory. You need to practice. It doesn't matter if you have no experience in judging before whatsoever. Everyone has to start somewhere. And if you are tired of debating or you don't have a partner, I highly encourage you to judge at like spas that happen every so often. Also encourage you to judge, practice giving OAs. It's not something that you are born with. It's something that's learned through constant practice. Yeah, so I would encourage you especially to give OA and then to get feedback on the OA. Maybe not from teams. I mean, teams sometimes will give you feedback, but usually they don't. It's usually better to get feedback on your justification, on your OA, from another judge on your panel. So if you are paneling and you have a chair, or you're a trainee and there's a chair, then you deliberate and you provide your justification to the chair. Just drop a message to the chair and ask them to provide some feedback on your justification, what you may be missing out in terms of the evaluation that you have made. No guarantees to get back to you. Like all things, feedback is seen more of an option rather than an obligation. I feel that judges should be obligated to give some feedback, however little it might be. But try your luck, and if the judge does get back to you, they can give you some helpful insight into how you can improve in the future. Okay, any questions before you end the session? If not, then I guess we'll end it here. Hope you found it helpful and hope it helps you in your debating career.